to our webinar today on advancing digital financial services reform through public-private dialogue. My name is Sylvia Bauer-Jasbeck, and I will be the moderator of today's webinar. I'm happy that so many of you are able to join us today. As it says in the title, this webinar focuses on the importance of public-private dialogue for digital financial sector reform processes and how funders can facilitate and support public-private dialogue. By funders, we are referring to all types of development agencies or private foundations who are supporting financial inclusion. Before we start, let me go over a few technical details with you. So this is an audio broadcast. You will realize your microphones are muted and they will remain muted during the entire webinar. If you want to ask questions during the webinar, please use the chat box that is on the right-hand side of the interface, and we will select a few questions for our discussion at the end. To make sure that we see your questions, please select all participants from the drop-down menu when posing your question in the chat. The webinar will be recorded, and we will make that recording available to all registrants after the webinar. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our speakers today, and they will bring three very different perspectives on how and when funders can support public-private dialogue in digital finance. First of all, I have Ilya Svatlov, who is the head of global partnerships at the Alliance for Financial Inclusion. He manages and oversees AFI's partnerships and engagement with sector stakeholders, including AFI's work on public-private cooperation. Prior to joining AFI, Ilya held various positions in the World Bank Group, at Yale University, and in the private sector. Then we also have Bilal Hagen here. He's the head of GIZ's Digitansis project in Jordan. The Digitansis project is supporting the development of digital financial services in Jordan in collaboration with the Central Bank of Jordan and the private sector. Prior to this position, Bilal worked for GIZ in Laos in the Access to Finance for the Poor project. And last but not least, we have Laura Atienza, who's a policy officer at the European Commission in Brussels at the International Partnerships Directorate General. She currently works in the implementation of the external investment plan and in particular in public-private dialogue and investment climate improvement. I would also like to introduce my colleagues Barbara Stoller in Paris and Anna Nunan here in Washington, who helped me with this webinar and are supporting us today. So let me briefly go over the agenda. After a very brief introduction from my side, Ilya will share how AFI has been supporting and facilitating public-private dialogue for their member regulators. Then Bilal will tell us how the DFS Council has helped in stimulating policy reforms in Jordan. And lastly, Laura will present how the European Commission is training their staff on facilitating public-private dialogue more effectively. So I will start with the introduction, and please don't forget to post your questions in the chat box on the right. So in our previous webinar, we discussed how to analyze drivers and barriers of regulatory reforms in the context of digital financial services. And one important set of barriers, which CGAP members are also observing in many markets, is linked to the lack of trust and lack of communication between digital financial service providers and regulators. Because of the different players and sectors that are involved in the provision of digital financial services, including also the many new non-financial players that are entering the market, it is really important to establish an effective dialogue. But it's also much more challenging. So in this webinar today, we will focus on how funders can help address this challenge by facilitating a dialogue between the public and the private actors. And this can also be called public-private dialogue. So public-private dialogue, why is it so critical? And it actually helps along the the path of a regulatory reform process during initiating a regulatory reform, implementing it, and adapting it. First of all, it allows regulators to learn about behaviors and needs in the market and understand what it needs to enable growth of inclusive and responsible financial services. It also helps the regulators to get an understanding what the potential impact could be of their decisions, of their policies. The private sector, on the other hand, can benefit from public-private dialogue by getting a better understanding of existing regulations and how to implement them. Then what is very important is that public-private dialogue is a way to build trust amongst those varied players and lay a foundation for a joint problem analysis and identification of the necessary institutional reforms that are needed to develop a more conducive environment for digital financial inclusion. And last but not least, public-private dialogue can also be used for monitoring and evaluating the impact of policy reforms. However, we also know that public-private dialogue is not a panacea and it's not very easy to implement. Our speakers today have been supporting and facilitating public-private dialogue in a variety of markets and contexts, so I want to hand it over to them to share their experiences on the ground and their lessons learned in facilitating public-private dialogue more effectively. So let me hand it over to Ilya first.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. I'm going to very quickly jump to the first slide, just by means of a quick introduction for those of you who are unfamiliar with AFI. We're a global alliance of financial regulators and policymakers from developing and emerging markets, representing about 85% of the world's unbanked population. We are a peer learning, member-owned and member-driven global network. And I say this because our public-private dialogue is very much rooted in those principles of knowledge exchange, peer learning, and being driven by the members. The objective from AFI's standpoint is to equip policymakers and regulators with the technical tools and the institutional capacity and the information that they need to implement financial inclusion policies and regulations. And we do this in 3 pillars. The first one is a high-level dialogue, which enables senior leaders from the public and private sector to agree on certain shared principles, which then inform their respective efforts. The second one is technical training and capacity building, where in some areas, especially those where the private sector holds unique expertise, we work with the private sector to build institutional capacity of our members. A couple of examples: digital payments, cybersecurity, areas of this sort, where the private sector really brings unique value and the members appreciate it. And the third one is in the aggregation of knowledge, which in AFI's terms is knowledge or policy guidance developed by regulators for other regulators. But of course, you cannot develop an issue policy guidance that looks at private sector activity without insights from the private sector. So we often go back to our private sector partners to provide those insights on the ground. And we work with a variety of private sector partners, from banks to telcos, essentially everyone who has a stakeholder role in advancing digital financial services. The benefits Sylvia touched on, so I'm not going to go into much detail, but just to say that one of the key benefits for our members is to really understand how markets are developing. What are the trends? What are the implications? What are the risk profiles of new products and services? And the private sector is able to supply that information on an ongoing basis. And what our private sector partners tell us, one of the key benefits is really understanding how regulators and policymakers work. Where are they in their policy implementation cycle? Where are they going? How are they thinking about certain issues? What do they worry about, and what opportunities do they seek? And when you have that common understanding, in our experience, good things start to happen. We launched our public-private, what we call the PPD platform, in 2014, and then in Davos the following year, established the guiding principles that have guided us ever since. And we've looked together at a number of areas related to DFS and have come up with common understandings around these areas. We've looked at questions such as, why isn't DFS being scaled up in developing markets in the way that it should? Or how do you leverage new technologies to advance financial inclusion for women, for example? More recently, because policymakers are looking at digital technologies, not from a product perspective, but from a broader ecosystem perspective, we started to look at questions around extended risks, such as cybersecurity, enabling ecosystems for fintech, data privacy, consumer protection, and so forth. And the products that come from this, they're documented shared understandings, which are pretty high level. And essentially what this is, it's a piece of paper, that captures these shared understandings. So on the face of it, it's not very much, but it really accomplishes a lot. Because when you have the private sector and the public sector be on the same page about what the real market and policy barriers are, where the opportunities are, then in their respective way, this trickles down into their activities at the country level, at the regional and global level. So what are the success factors, but more important, what are the lessons for funders, for policymakers, for the private sector? The first one is in establishing an effective public-private dialogue. Protocols have to be followed. So if you have governors, deputy governors at the table, of course you would want a similar level from the private sector and representation. You want to establish effective rules of the game, so to speak, where the private sector doesn't advocate for specific products and services. Rather, they present and talk about issues in a very frank and systematic way. And what we found, a key lesson for us, is that one of the benefits of effective public-private dialogue is that it builds trust. And this is absolutely essential for both regulators to do their work and for the private sector to do effective business. But it takes time. If we look at the earlier activities of public-private engagement in AFI, I have to say we've come quite a long way, where both sides can talk in a very transparent way about some very difficult issues, and this has not always been the case. So creating a proper environment goes a long way toward building that trust. In our experience, this may be slightly controversial, but we see public-private dialogue being very effective and policymakers being receptive if it is hosted and implemented on the regulator's own turf. And what I mean by that is that the regulator drives the dialogue and invites the private sector to contribute these insights. And this ensures that the process is driven by the policy and regulatory priorities of the countries, but also gives a comfort level to the private sector to be able to speak honestly because they know that they can in that sort of a setting. We've seen it be less successful if it is driven by the private sector and the regulator is invited to join. In that case, we see some sensitivities. And happy to talk about that more. Another important lesson is that you can't just talk about these issues, no matter how important, without building the technical capacity of the regulators to really understand and to really be able to then implement policy. So there has to be very practical follow-up in terms of the implementation on the ground, building capacity, and incorporating the lessons that are garnered from the dialogue into the various activities. Final lesson is that public and private sector must commit to making this set of activities financially sustainable. So whereas donors have a role, and I think my colleagues will talk about this a little bit more, donors have a role in coming in at an appropriate time. They also have a role in exiting at a certain time. And when they exit, or before they exit rather, we have to make sure that both the private sector and the public sector have a stake in the game. And that's a financial stake, an intellectual stake, and a technical one. So maybe final slide, just to leave you with an interesting thought. Former governor of the Central Bank of Kenya, our former chair, Professor Ndungu is known to say that we as central bank governors see ourselves increasingly as champions of private sector development. And this is because the mandates of our member institutions are expanding. And at the same time, technologies are changing so quickly that we see a convergence between public and private sector needs and interests. And this creates very important opportunities to strengthen and expand public-private dialogue at the country level and at the regional and the global level.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ilya. We'll pass it over to Bilal.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. And I would like to present you how we were setting up the DFS Council here in Jordan within our supporting, coming out from our Digitensis project starting in 2015. Let me give you a very brief overview of the ecosystem in Jordan, especially for the ones who might not know all the details here. So we had a very high influx of refugees, especially the Syrian refugees, roughly 1 million, 1.2 million, with a relatively low financial inclusion rate, which is now by around 42%, coming out for 24% by 2014, according to the FinEx World Bank data, with having a lot of unemployment, 90%, and within the youth, it's even 30%. The remittances inflows to Jordan is 11% of the GDP, 2017, very huge amount. And concerning the private sector, providing digital financial services and e-wallets, we have now 6 PSPs. Our project approach, to give you a very, very fast overview, so we are targeting the Syrian refugees and the low-income Jordanian people, and having now also some migrant workers that we are going also to target. We are working on the supply side with the private sector, also including humanitarian organizations, and our political partner is the Central Bank of Jordan, the CBJ, where we are supporting them on regulatory framework, and we're much more now on instructions. And the binding element, especially between the public, the CBJ and the public sector and the PSPs, is the dialogue between them, and the one instrument is the DFS Council. So the background of the DFS Council is it was starting in 2015, when there was nothing basically here in the market. There was no regulation, no PSPs. So with the preparation of the regulation, with the PSPs after that applying for the license, the humanitarian organization having very strong interest to look for digital solutions for providing the payments to the target groups, mainly the Syrian refugees. There was a really big need for all the stakeholders to discuss together. And this is how in 2015 we were establishing the DFS Council, with having as some main objectives to enrich the knowledge of the members, to give a platform for discussion, peer-to-peer exchange of experience on the development of the DFS sector worldwide, and then also in Jordan. We have for sure one key element of the DFS Council is the secretariats. So this is the ongoing body where we have the CBJ supported by us, by the GIZ over the last years, where we were identifying together the stakeholders, and for sure the ongoing big activities to identify the next topics, looking for external speakers and guests, and to coordinate all the preparation, the logistic preparation of the DFS Council. So looking at the venue, the time, the invitation, sending the minutes and the documentation after each DFS Council. Well, we have, I would like to give you a very brief overview so that you get a better feeling also how it's really looking like. And so first at the beginning, it was set up in a consultative process. So not only with the CBJ, but also with all the key stakeholders. Then also to have an engagement of the different stakeholders, we were looking to have a rotative basis to organize the hosting of the DFS Council until the reshaping of 2019. I can tell maybe a little bit more now, or also later in the Q&A session. But very briefly at the beginning, we had quite a lot of members, and then last year there was some assessment and needs to have some reshaping to give another time some dynamic in the process. We have about four DFS Council each year, so on quarterly basis, and we are asking each member to have a maximum of 2 persons participating to the council, and also to send all the time the same person to ensure the continuity from one council to another. The facilitation of the meeting, especially in the previous format, a bit bigger format, was done all the time by a neutral party, neutral site, many times by the GIZ, but also sometimes we had also some facilitators. And the methodology that we use there is that we have different formats. For sure, when we have a speaker, then he will give an input. We will have some Q&A. And we were all the time looking to have some active participation of the members by having group works and then exchange again within the plenary, and using also some kind of discussion methods like the fishbowls, where the speakers can be replaced by another one. Certainly, many of you knows that. And here, what you see the picture on the left now, this is the new setting. So where we have a little bit a smaller group. We had indeed at the beginning 40 members with, for sure, the central bank, different departments of the central bank, the PSP, the private sector, and the humanitarian organization. In the new setting, we are really concentrating on the primary stakeholders. So the CBG on one side, less departments, and mainly the PSPs and some IMTOs. Okay. Yes. So as main achievements, we were really having a successful creation and shaping of the DFS sector in Jordan over the last year, with a dynamic engagement of all the stakeholders, especially in the first year, by achieving a high participation, and also between the members, we were having really a trustful dialogue, and that is really also very interesting to think that all the time we have all the PSPs who are basically competitors who are sitting there and exchanging during the DFS Council and in dialogue with the regulator, with the CBJ. And I was mentioning also before, the high motivation, especially in the first years, was very, very, very interesting to see, with the strong interest on both sides, the private and the public sector. We were also seeing some limits in the DFS Council. So what here were key in Jordan, the DFS Council is a platform for dialogue, for exchange, knowledge exchange, but it's principally not there where you will have the decision, especially not the final decisions taking. This, especially regulation and things like that, will be at the end of the day at the CBJ. But preparation, better understanding, making some feedback that is for sure one of the very good impact of the DFS Council. Then, what I was mentioning before, there was a need of reshaping the DFS Council after four years. There was a little bit less interest, maybe, for example, from the side of the humanitarian organization by knowing how now the sector was working, having a certain maturity of the sector, so that there was, based on the feedback of the members, an assessment where there was a decision taken to concentrate really on the primary stakeholders. The big question is for sure the sustainability. Ilya was also mentioning that before. So maybe for sure it's not maybe the question of DFS Council or like working groups maybe not last for all the life, but definitely from the side of the members there is a very clear currently feedback that they want to have the continuation. For now we are supporting the secretariat from our GIZ side. We are looking for the coming year to have handing over to the CBJ, where we have also to see how are they, or to tackle with them, to support them to increase the resources and the capacities to do all this nitty-gritty work, so that beyond 21 we can still have this nice format. Thank you very much, and I hand it over now to Laura.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to speak about why DEVCO is the Director General for International Partnerships, so for Development Cooperation of the European Commission, why DEVCO is working more than before in public-private dialogue, why are we developing more capacity in this area within our troops, let's say, internally, and how are we doing it? So to give a very short background of European Commission as it stands today and what means the DG for International Partnerships, of the priorities of the Commission now, one of them is stronger Europe in the world, and part of this priority is the external policies, among which international development and cooperation, which is where I work. And the mission of DEVCO, or DG International Partnerships, it has these two names. It just changed the name because we have a new commission from recently. The mission is to eradicate poverty and foster sustainable development. The scope is non-industrialized third countries. And to give you an idea of how many we are, and therefore how we want and we need to reach our people in EU delegations and headquarters, we are about 900 staff in headquarters and around 4,000 in 123 delegations. From these 4,000, half of them are not so much related to the operations of programs. So let's say that half of those are being targeted by the work that we are recently doing in DG DEVCO to work more in public. Why are we working on this? Well, since 2015, you may well know that there was a shift in development cooperation at the international level. There was this acknowledgement in international conferences that the private sector should also contribute to development objectives, and that we needed not billions but trillions of investment if we wanted to attain the development goals. And we started to talk about the SDGs instead of the ODGs. Well, then this shift was also translated into the EU policies of development, and we started to develop more tools to leverage private investment for development. As a result of that, in 2017, we launched the External Investment Plan that you can see now in the slide. I'm coming there, which is about having new tools to leverage private investment with new guarantee programs, and also to focus more on investment climate improvement in our partner countries. About improving the investment climate in our partner countries, public-private dialogue is one key element of that. How we want to improve investment climate in partner countries, first by doing a more thorough analysis of or where are the obstacles, how can we improve investment climate, which includes business environment reforms, and in order also to identify the most relevant actions, we have to support more public-private dialogue in the countries. So that's where it comes from. And in terms of actions, how to prioritize them, well, public-private dialogue is a necessary tool to identify precisely the most relevant actions for where the EU can support to improve the investment climate. So this is the explanation of why are we working more in public-private dialogue, which is to bring more private investment in a sustainable manner and to create more jobs and contribute to inclusive growth and development. Well, how we are doing this now? Well, improving capacities first in analysis of investment climate, in how to facilitate public-private dialogues, and how to design and implement and follow up actions which are useful to improve the investment climate in the countries. First, what we've done is to kind of launch the Sustainable Business for Africa platform. I'm saying Africa because the external investment plan is concentrated, I didn't mention this, in the African countries and neighborhood countries. So we launched the Sustainable Business for Africa platform, which has a strong component of public-private dialogue. And then with a long-term approach to develop in-house knowledge and develop internal capacity building, also supported by consultancy support. Personally, I manage a facility, which is the Trade and Private Sector Development Facility, which is managed by DI Consultancy. And this is how also we have the means to support better our colleagues. Then this would be the first way. And then a second step is to join forces more with EU member states. Because like GIZ has just presented now, EU member states have many actions around public-private dialogue actions that can be can further be coordinated, have a strong impact. So first, what we did, well, first we did a baseline first. What are we doing what are our African EU delegations doing? How are they facilitating or not public-private dialogue in their countries? How they perceive the situation about public-private dialogues, and where the EU could have a value added. So we did this survey last year for the first time. We want it to be a yearly exercise, and we also concentrated on effectiveness and inclusivity to evaluate a bit how PPD is being in the countries. And we did country profiles. If this is of interest to any of you, we can also share this information. And from there, we had some interesting information from delegations, and we could start working more in detail with them. We've also done physical training, so we've trained more than 800 people within the last 2 years, so we are doing basically monthly trainings. We have done several learning videos and info point sessions. These are sessions which are open to the public here in Brussels, and they are also web streamed. We did one recently, for instance, on public-private dialogue in fragile context with a case study of Liberia. And this is public, so again, this can be shared with you. We've also developed guidelines and reference documents so that people could know what we're talking about, and also have some reference where to go back if they need a specific explanation, or to relate to external stakeholders with a bit of meat, let's say. So we did these guidelines on public-private dialogue for Sustainable Business for Africa platform. We just finished business environment reform guidelines that are going to be public very shortly in March. And we are preparing notes on public-private dialogue in fragile contexts with very specific examples. We also focus a lot on talking to our colleagues, just talking to peers, exchanging, doing network, making an annual meeting, and then doing interviews and videos to share with those who were not there, for instance. So that's a very much of the focus we do, and it's working quite well. We also have done a SharePoint, which is available for all our EU delegations in the world, and relevant director generals here in Brussels, so that information is available to you. We have specifically supported 26 EU delegations with 32 short-term missions at their demand. So what we have done, for instance, we have done mapping of the private sector, mapping of the stakeholders, suggestions of how to further engage with the private sector with a roadmap. We have analyzed specific hurdles, how the financial system is working in the country, where the EU could work better in that, etc. So these are the types of things that we've been doing, including also support to chambers of commerce in the countries. Examples of results, just mentioned now, mapping of the private sector and public-private dialogue roadmap in several countries. For instance, in Guinea-Conakry, we also included some support to the EU Chamber of Commerce in the country, and it was launched thanks to the short-term mission that we did. We also work in mainstreaming public-private dialogue in existing and new programs. For instance, in Senegal, there's a 30 million euro budget support program, which is entirely devoted to investment climate improvement. It has elements such as having a commercial court improved, or having a one-stop shop for entrepreneurs, and improving the digital e-tax for collection and explanation of taxes for SMEs. Another example is what the delegation of Uganda has done, which is the SB4 Uganda. So they've gathered different champions from the public and private sector around 3 areas: around corruption, skills and attitudes, and access to finance. Around these 3 areas, they have been discussing for a year. They've done a roadmap, and now they are basing on results, step-by-step, things to be improved in the more easy way at the beginning. Yeah, so I won't go further because I know time is going by. So what's next? We want to further develop specific areas because we have still a lot to learn and a lot to exchange with our colleagues. So for instance, what has been said today for digital financial inclusion is very interesting for us. And we also want to concentrate more on women economic empowerment. We are concentrating more and more in this area, how to improve business environment reform with a gender approach. And we have also new programs to support our endeavors in further facilitating and supporting public-private dialogue and investment climate. Oops, sorry. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Laura, Bilal, and Ilya, for your inputs. I will now ask a couple of questions to our speakers. In the meanwhile, I would like to encourage our audience to please also share questions and put them into the chat on the bottom right corner. So let me start with a question back to Laura. In which context do you see, from the experience of the European Commission, that public-private dialogue is useful and necessary to drive effective policy reform processes? What have you learned on the ground?
Well, in general, public-private dialogue is useful when there are policy reforms that affect, that have some impact in businesses. And businesses are very heterogeneous, and private sector is very different. So there can be quite an important number of policy reform processes that could have an impact on businesses. And that's why to have, at the best, it would be good to have an established and structured process of PPD in the countries. The more inclusive, the best, and the more effective, the better, of course. So that would be in general terms. Then, for instance, the other day, our delegation from Rwanda just dropped us some lines saying that the Rwanda Food and Drug Administration released recently a regulation with very high fees for the registration of products, of all types of products, on the Rwandan market. So this potentially could have a very detrimental impact on the development of the private sector in the country and very different types of private sector. So, and there was not, there has not been a consultation with the private sector before doing this regulation. This is something where this is a clear example where this would be very beneficial to do this, and also to do an impact evaluation of the regulatory framework.
Thank you, Laura. Ilya, I'd also really like to understand your perspective as a regulator member organization. You really understand very well how policymakers think. And could you maybe share with us a little bit, how do regulators think about funders' ability to support public-private dialogue, and where do regulators see the role of funders in supporting public-private dialogue?
Sure. Thank you, Sylvia. It's a very good question. Without generalizing, there are 3 or 4 key areas where funders' support in a timely manner is absolutely vital. The first one is supporting what stems from the public-private dialogue, and that is policy implementation on the ground. Yeah, so very tailored support towards specific policy initiatives is one. 2, the majority of funders who support public-private dialogue bring unique technical expertise in addition to funds. And this is just as important to countries, certainly to AFI and to our partners, because funders also bring a global perspective, a regional and a country perspective. And this is very valuable, particularly with, to countries who are in the beginning stages of their journey. The third area is funders have a unique opportunity by working with partners, with CGAP, with AFI, with GIZ and DEVCO and others, to scale up learnings from single country experiences to inform others. Really using our platforms that are already in existence as a multiplier effect, so that the impact is greater and achieved at greater scale. Yeah. And then the fourth way is really to understand, and I cannot stress this enough, really to understand members, or our members, but policymakers' needs, but also, of course, the needs of the private sector, and to tailor their support very specifically to those needs, and to let the local stakeholders really drive the process.
Thank you so much, Ilya. Bilal, in Jordan, you have the experience that the digital financial service sector spans across so many different players. It's not only financial sector, it's also the ICT and telco sector. So how has been your experience in building trust amongst all those different players? Can you maybe share some tips, some lessons learned on how you managed to build that trust in the room, to have frank and open discussions?
Yeah, with pleasure. Yeah, I think this is very important question, and this was one of the objectives of one of the key objectives of the DFS Council, and I think one of the very good achievements. So certainly the starting point is very important. That what we were doing here is that we had participatory approach by not only talking with the CBG, our political partner, but including many of the key stakeholders of the private sector, and then eventually with the first workshop to have also one of the elements to set up the different the setting, let's say, the different requirements of the workshop, which I was describing in my presentation. this is one part. The other part after that is also what we were able to establish there is to ensure certain ownership by, for example, having this principle of rotative hosting of the DFS Council in the venue of the partners. Especially, we have the chance that the young startup, some IMTO were providing their very innovative offices, and that was a very important point. Then also during the organization of the DFS Council, to ensure that we have also a mix between the people by very simple things that everyone knows. By when you have this big conference of meeting, that you have some this small methodology that you have a kind of random way to sit on the table so that you ensure a mix, and you have the people of different organizations are getting known with one another by sitting on the table, not with the one from their own organization, the one that knows the best. And then looking also all the time to get the feedback from the members at with each DFS Council. We have small questionnaires where we especially ask for the next topics, which is really taking into account by defining the coming topics for the next DFS Council.
Thank you very much, Pilar. Laura, I'd like to ask you another question, which is a very important question that also Ilya mentioned in his presentation, which is around when should funders exit? And based on your experience, what are you recommending to your delegations in terms of when and how they should exit their role as a facilitator of the public-private dialogue?
Yes, thank you. This is a very good question indeed. So as Ilya has mentioned, sustainability, say organizational financial sustainability is one of let's say probably the key thing that we have to think about since the beginning. And this also determines a bit how we have thought about our intervention or our support to a PPD process, then determines how we can exit it or not. So knowing that we are not, or donors should not be in the driver's seat, but should help facilitate and provide capacity, etc. If we are in a positive situation where financial, operational sustainability is there, then we should consider to exit it because the objective has been met. Usually these processes are long, depending on the context. Can be shorter or longer, but usually these are long processes of years where in which trust have to be, as other colleagues here, Bilal, also have mentioned, trust has to be created and hopefully capacity also developed. So thinking since the beginning about this, then maybe we can leave when the objectives of financial and operational sustainability have been met. Then you can also have other situations where you see that the support provided maybe is not the most adequate one, and you can reevaluate the situation, and we can call it an exit or a reevaluation of the situation. And for instance, maybe we have focused in supporting specific entities or specific entities which are not so representative, or we should be concentrating more in capacity building of some other entities at grassroots level, and this can be analyzed and reevaluated. And also there can be the situation that prerequisites of the will of government and the will of private sector and the agreement on their respective roles as prerequisites is not anymore there. So situations where the context just changes, and there we have to see what is our role there, if there's a role, and which one. Yeah.
Yeah, your answer actually leads very nicely into my next question, which is to Ilya. I wonder, from your experience at AFI, you work very closely with regulators. So what actually can public-private dialogue resolve and what can it not resolve?
Yeah, thanks, Sylvia. It's maybe one of the most important questions that funders and everybody on this webinar should be asking themselves. And we have to be very practical, right? There are certain things that public-private dialogue will just not do. So what is one of those in our experience? Again, maybe slightly controversial, but I don't think you could create a truly equal partnership between the private sector and the public sector, and I'll give you my rationale. The regulator has a different time horizon and slightly different objectives than the private sector. In many instances, they may move slower, but this is also because their risk appetite is significantly different from the private sector. The concerns of a regulator are primarily around consumer protections, consumer empowerment, and of course also to develop the private sector, whereas the private sector, the objectives will always remain profit-oriented objectives. Now, that's what, in my opinion, cannot be done fully. That said, I would also pose that you don't need a truly equal partnership. What you need to do is you have to have a shared understanding on both sides, some joint objectives, which could be implemented in a complementary way by the regulators doing what they do best and by the private sector doing what the private sector does best. And then establish enough effective touch points for them to connect and to make sure that they're on track together toward common objectives. And then you will start to see effective impact on the ground. So that's maybe one of the things.
Thank you very much, Ilya. Let me maybe pose that question also to Bilal, since you also work very closely with the central bank in Jordan. What role has the DFS Council played, and what other activities have been needed, and what type of support has been useful in driving regulatory reform in Jordan?
So yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, let me just maybe mention what some of the concrete topics that we were addressing, especially in the first 2 years. So we were, for example, having some two DFS Council on the topic of EML CFT to get a better understanding on one side, to have the exchange on the other side, and then eventually the Central Bank of Jordan working on a concrete instructions for the PSPs for EML CFT. So for sure, as I was saying, at the end of the day, they were taking the final decision and developing the instruction, but they were presenting or sharing the document, a draft document to the PSP, and looking to get their feedback and their comments, which were to a certain extent also taking into account. That was one of the major, very concrete work on which we were working. The other point now is the current point that we have, what we had last year, where I must say on the same time is a little bit a certain limit of the DFS Council, but it was still a useful platform to address certain concern regarding the cross-border remittances activities, which are still pending due to some fears from the PSPs of the interpretation of the CBG of the regulation, which were quite conservative scenarios was the one that was principally accepted, expecting the PSPs to work with the exchange houses. And the DFS Council, maybe not in a very formal way because we had other topics, but in an informal way during the breakout sessions was also a platform to address the concern towards the CBJ in this regard. where the department, the financial inclusion unit especially, was able to give it back to the other departments within the CBJ. Yeah, this is what I can mention here.
Yeah, thank you, Bilal. I have one question from the audience, which is a little bit around whether there is a certain maturity needed, like a maturity of the DFS market, to make public-private dialogue to make sense, so that public-private dialogue makes sense in the digital financial services market. So what Nara is asking here is whether it also makes sense to develop a public-private dialogue platform in a country where the DFS market is still very nascent. Maybe, Ilya, do you have something to say on that?
Sure. Well, in the AFI network, we have members at very different stages in their DFS policy development. Some who are true innovators from the early stages and have actually leapfrogged through brick and mortar to go directly to mobile and DFS. Others who are just in the beginning of their financial inclusion journey. For those who are more toward the beginning, my belief is that it still makes sense to establish public-private dialogue in the very early stages, but of course it needs to be of a different nature and it needs more comprehensive support. One of the ways that we through AFI do this is by connecting our members, so the policymaking institutions in the beginning stages, with those who are more experienced, so that they could be guided by their peers from other markets who have already underwent this, and then they could have the confidence that even in this beginning stage of their journey, important considerations can be discussed and important policy steps can be taken.
Great, excellent, thank you. We are coming to the end of the webinar, so I would like to ask one final question to each of you, which is, if you were to provide a recommendation to a funder colleague in supporting public-private dialogue, what would be your key recommendation? Let me start with Laura, please.
Thank you. If it's one, I would say to do a good political and economy and stakeholder analysis to see whether what's more relevant to be done and identify well the stakeholders, both in public and private sector, so as to ensure that we want in which objectives are we going to focus, how inclusive we design the support or not, etc. That's what I would say the one. Yeah.
Thank you. Bilal, what would be your number one recommendation for colleagues?
Yeah, what would like to come out of, for sure, of our experience here in Jordan and talking on public-private dialogue on a national level. And here, one very big recommendation would be to, out of this proper stakeholder analysis, to include the key stakeholders and even beyond on the setting of the format of the council and this public-private partnership platform that you would like and the ones you would like to create, by defining very clearly the objectives and how you are going to work together, and looking to have ownership of the different stakeholders.
Excellent, yeah. Ilya.
Thanks. Yeah, the key recommendation is to let the process be driven by the local stakeholders, to really understand what their policy and private sector needs are, and then to support them in achieving those needs. So that way they feel ownership and the process is likely to be more sustainable. I'm going to cheat and do a second one very quickly, and that is don't replicate what's already in existence. So in fact, leverage the platforms that are already in place to amplify what you're trying to do on the ground.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you also to the audience for joining us today, and I'm sure you also learned new things as I did, and I wish you a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you again for joining.
So the same. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.